Imagine a game where you play as a knight of the round table, Sir Galahad, a grizzled protagonist in a steampunk Victorian world, battling lycans and rebels with the gravitas that rivals any blockbuster. And in this world, you are gifted with some of the most intriguing world building that video games has ever seen, only to be ripped away from it by some of the most baffling choices that have ever been made in video games. Welcome to The Order 1886, a 2015 PS4 exclusive developed by Ready at Dawn that is both mesmerizing and maddening. Very much a product of its time, this ambitious gem from the now shuttered studio Ready at Dawn feels like a brilliant idea caught in a race against the clock, bursting with potential and yet tripping over unrefined gameplay and odd design choices. Was it a bold, ahead-of-its-time experiment, or was it a noble attempt, but ultimately a misfire? Let's dive into the beautifully messy legacy of The Order 1886. Obviously, spoilers ahead for the story. It's hard for me to believe that as of this year, The Order 1886 was released a decade ago. 10 years ago in 2015, this game was released. And when enough time passes, the initial feelings that someone may have had about a game begin to kind of fade and nostalgia takes over. So let's journey back to 2015 and see if we can remember how this game was received upon release. If you need a reminder, or maybe you weren't into games back in 2013, we have to journey back to when the PlayStation 4 was first revealed. In February of 2013, PlayStation held an event where they announced the PlayStation 4 and several titles that were being designed to kind of build up the hype for the release of the PlayStation 4. At this event, we saw trailers and reveals for things like infamous Second Son, Killzone Shadowfall, Drive Club, and Knack. You remember Knack? And while the event was widely praised for this reveal of the PS4, it still felt like it was kind of missing something. Fast forward to June of 2013 at PlayStation's E3 press conference, and the reveal trailer for The Order begins to play. And for me at least, at that point, the hype train left the station. This looked truly fresh, a brand new IP, a unique gameplay setting, an interesting world to immerse ourselves in. This is what I was waiting for with the PS4 release. This is what I wanted from a next-gen console. And as the game got closer and closer to release, we started to get sort of drip-fed bits and pieces of the game and the story and gameplay elements. And eventually we got that gameplay reveal of the shootout on the Zeppelin, on the airship, and I was like, this is exactly what I'm looking for in the PS4 generation. But then as we got a little bit closer to that first release date, things got a little quiet, and then eventually the game was delayed. And I was disappointed at the time for sure, but then I thought, delays help make games better, so take your time, make the game as good as it needs to be before it's released. And then the release window finally hit, and I remember waking up to see the reviews the day the embargo released, and I was so disappointed. Because to my shock, this game that was like driving the hype train for PlayStation's success was getting not 8 and 9s out of 10, but 5s and 6s and 7s out of 10s. And I was stunned. How could a game that was this beautiful, that was backed by PlayStation, that had the support of PlayStation's premium studios in Sony Santa Monica, how could a game like this be getting a 5 or a 6 out of 10? The critics must have it wrong, I thought. They're all complaining about the time it takes to beat the game, saying that you could beat the game in as little as 6 hours, and I thought that's ridiculous. They're just blitzing through the story to try to get reviews ready. That's not indicative of what the game will be like. And so on release day, I downloaded the game, and within 2 sittings, 2 gameplay sessions, I too had beaten the game in about 6 hours. And I wasn't blitzing through the story. I was checking every nook and cranny, trying to get as much out of the game as possible. And I beat it in about 6 hours. And with the review scores that it had received, and with word spreading on the internet about this, this crazy hype level game that was supposed to sell PS4s, that type of game could be beaten in a day, The Order 1886 was essentially dead on arrival. Sony never acknowledged or publicly released any sales numbers. And if you know Sony, they love to brag about successful games and successful hardware sales. And so if Sony is not bragging about your game, it's safe to assume that it's on the chopping block. And so here we are now, 10 years later, and I'm wondering, did we get it right about The Order 1886? Is it truly a 5 or a 6 out of 10? Is it such a failure that it deserves to be archived in history never to be revisited in a sequel or a prequel or anything. As I mentioned earlier, I played through and I platinumed The Order 1886 when it first released 10 years ago, and now I found myself 10 years later missing my good friend Sir Galahad. Because it's been a decade since playing, I had forgotten most of the game and most of the story, and so I thought now would be a good time, a great time to immerse myself back into the world of The Order. And as I replayed it, I found myself completely captivated by the rich story and the stellar voice acting performances, and then I found myself laughing at the unintentionally hilarious fights and battles with the Lycans, and then I would marvel at the music and the insane visuals that still hold up 10 years later, and then I would find myself groaning at endless QuickTime events throughout the game. But as I played through this game, I came to a realization. The Order 1886 is a fascinating case study, both in game development and in our expectations for games and how we respond to something that doesn't quite meet the hype that we have built up ourselves or that a marketing team has wanted us to build up in ourselves. So I want to dive deeper into this game and share my experience playing through it again 10 years later and ask the question, is The Order 1886 a misunderstood diamond in the rough? Or is it yet another Icarus of gaming that, through its own ambition, has flown too close to the sun? So let's start with the good. What are the good parts of The Order 1886? And the good news is, there's a lot of good in this game. There's actually a lot of great in this game, I would say. I think the biggest success and the thing that keeps people talking about The Order 1886 is the story. It's the setting. It's the world that these people have built. This world and its characters are so interesting right off the bat that you can't help but be intrigued by the past and how they came to this alternate history in London and their present and all the circumstances that they find themselves surrounded in and what could have been in the future of this world. The design and the aesthetic of the world is immediately interesting. You're placed in London, 1886, and so there's this sense of instant familiarity, and then immediately we also learn things that are not quite familiar to us, because while we may recognize the London skyline and the smokestacks that are billowing from that Industrial Revolution time period, we also see airships flying in the sky and weapons that can shoot lightning and protagonists that can communicate via the wireless radio on their shoulders. You see, we've seen steampunk worlds before, but something about this scary and unsettling world feels so inviting, obviously not from a hospitable point of view, but from its mystery and its intrigue. It just pulls you in. This feels like a world where you want to meet a hero, a person who will lead the charge against the darkness of the Lycans and usher in this kind of age of prosperity for London. But we learn quickly that this isn't a stereotypical hero quest where the good guy beats the bad guy and everything is magically fixed. The story takes so many twists and turns, and people that you thought were surefire friends forged in combat turn out to be traitors, some of them literal wolves in sheep's clothing, and enemies become the only friends that you can rely on as your character, Galahad, goes on a journey that transforms not only him, but the entire world that he has fought to save for hundreds of years. So let's talk about Sir Galahad, or Grayson as his friends know him. This character is awesome. Galahad is one of the Knights of the Order, thought to be around 400 years old. And he is kind of this honorable and driven character that we immediately know and love. His motivations are pretty simple on the surface, at least. He's motivated to fight to protect the Order and to destroy the enemies of the Order, namely the Lycans. But as the story progresses, we learn that while his motivations may seem simple, the driving force for Galahad is not the Order. We see pretty often that he's more than willing to bend the rules here and there, even rules that the Order has set in order to protect. So Galahad is not motivated by loyalty to the Order. Rather, he is motivated by this fierce loyalty to pursuing the right and righteous path, no matter the consequences. And it's through this lens that it becomes easier to view Galahad as more of like a Batman-type character. Someone who is so driven by their one rule, even and especially at the expense of any consequences. From the first mission, Galahad notices Percival having a strange conversation with a stranger, and Galahad begins to poke and pull at this story thread even after Percival tells him that there's nothing to explain. And as Galahad continues to ask questions, he begins to understand that while there is true dark and light in this world, the assumptions that he has made, or rather the assumptions that have been handed to him by the Order, may not quite line up with the truth of who is good and who is evil. And as the game progresses, you see Galahad's understanding shift of who his real allies and enemies are. But the driving force for Galahad always remains the same, even when it causes him immense pain and discomfort. By the end of the game, Galahad loses everything that he has known and loved for hundreds of years. He has to face the reality that for perhaps hundreds of years, his life's work has been spent protecting the wrong people from harm. Because even though Galahad is motivated and driven by that righteous act, he also deeply relies on the people around him to guide him and to lead him. And that's what I find really interesting about this character, is that he is not the leader. He's not in charge of the Order. He's not even in charge of his squad at the beginning of the game. Galahad is a follower, and he's good at it, and you can tell he loves that aspect of his role. He gets to put his trust in the people above him, and when they say go, he goes. When they say stop, he stops. But this relentless need for truth and for that righteous act for Galahad continues to pull at him under the surface. Too many things continue to go wrong. There's too many things that are suspicious, that are swept aside, and issues are ignored. And so Galahad, we see, grow as a person while we play the game, and he experiences tremendous hurt. His leaders betray him, his friends turn against him, and everything that he puts his trust in ultimately fails him. And still, in spite of all that, at the end of the game, he remains drawn and motivated by doing the right thing, even at the expense of himself. And so when he's faced at the end of the game with that choice of killing Lucan, the selfish thing to do would be to walk away from everything. Let Lucan recover from his wounds and continue this scheme or this allying with the vampires to preserve their race. That's the easy thing to do. The easy answer is just walk away. The hard answer is to realize that even though the Order has wronged many people in their pursuit of what they would call justice, Galahad understands that the Lycans, even though they've been oppressed by the Order, are still wrong in what they've pursued, and they're not without excuse. And so even though the Lycans have been wronged, the Lycans are still dangerous, and they've been a force for danger for many years. And that's what I love about this story. What seemingly starts as this simple good guy versus bad guy story turns into a everyone is a bad guy type of story. And that story turns into Galahad chooses to pursue good. And I love that. And all the voice actors do an amazing job, an excellent job of conveying the complexity of their characters and of this story. There are no weak links in the cast. Galahad displays a ton of range in his character, but everyone around him is a showcase in excellent voice acting. So that's the great part of the game. Let's talk about the kind of in the middle mixed part of the game. And this is where I think the Order gets a little muddled, because while I think there are some clear good and some clear bad and annoying parts of the game, there are these pieces that fit in the middle, and I think they're more symptomatic of larger issues with the game. So let's start here with the length of the game. This is the thing that basically every reviewer mentioned in their review of the game back in 2015. And it was mentioned as a negative. The game is too short. That's what people would say. Just when it starts getting good, just when it starts ramping up, it feels like you're ripped out of the game. It ends on a cliffhanger that they didn't earn. It's too short. That's what everyone was saying 10 years ago. But I gotta say, as I was playing through the game again, by the time I got to the final chapters, I was ready for the game to be done. And not from a perspective of like, oh my gosh, I cannot wait for the game to be done, but more so from the mentality that I just didn't want the game to overstay its welcome. It felt like a good place to stop. You see, I think I've matured a lot in the last 10 years. And when the game first came out, I will admit, I was super disappointed that I paid full price for a game that I could beat in 6 hours. But I also wonder how much of that expectation was set by the surrounding environment of the Order 1886. Let's look back at 2015 and remember some of the top games that came out that year. Remember, in 2015, we had The Witcher 3, Fallout 4, Metal Gear Solid 5, and Bloodborne, amongst many other games. Those games alone are some of the greatest games ever made, with the exception of Fallout 4. I maintain that Fallout 4 sucks. You can fight me on it. But regardless of my opinions, the general consensus was that these games are great, and they are all long games. The Witcher 3 alone has a story that can take you 50 hours to complete. So that is the environment that the Order is released into. The expectation in 2013, 2014, 2015, when the Order was deep in development, was that if you want a good game, you need to make a long game. But we know, as gamers, fundamentally, that is not true. Some of the greatest games of the last 15 to 20 years are very short games. Games like Limbo and Inside and Journey are notoriously short, and obviously those are indie-made games. But even in the AAA space, we have short games. Gears of War 1, notoriously short. Still a great game. A Space Marine 2 is a recent example. Short game. Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice is a great game and can be beaten in, you guessed it, 6 to 8 hours. So while I understand the complaint of game too short from reviewers and critics, I think that is a misdiagnosis of the issue that's really at the heart of the Order. The issue is not that the game is too short, at least for me. The issue rather is, what do you do with your short game? If you have a short game, but the narrative excels and the story is well paced and the gameplay is polished and tight and focused and movement feels good and the game feels like it's driving toward the goal that was set by the developer to entertain gamers, then I don't care if your game is 5 hours or 50 hours. I care about you meeting your goals and making an entertaining game. And so when you look at the Order 1886, I've already praised, with the highest praise, the story and the narrative. So what's the issue with the game that left so many people with a sour enough feeling upon playing the game to slap a 5 or a 6 out of 10 on this game? Well, if the short length is a symptom, I think the proper diagnosis of the sickness at play in the Order is ambition to do more. More equals better. That's what the market was telling developers in the 2010s. And Ready at Dawn took this to mean that while they are making a narrative-driven cover shooter, they also have to add in as many random gameplay elements as possible because more equals better. And we'll talk about some of those gameplay elements in the bad section of the game because I think there's a lot of them. But I think it's worth understanding that a short game isn't necessarily bad because it's short. Rather, with the Order, it seems like it's short because it's bad. And let me explain what I mean by that. I think, and some of the developers have actually come out publicly and said this from Ready at Dawn, that they were so set on building a big game, building a trilogy, building this big world for the Order 1886. They started out of the gate in development trying to build a big with lots of different gameplay elements. But as time goes on, the ambition to build this type of game hits the brick wall of reality, and reality for developers often comes in the form of budgets and due dates. And when you're up against a due date and your bills are being paid by somebody else, you need to make a decision. Either we release a crappy game with completely unfinished gameplay elements, or we start chopping up the game to try and salvage what we've already made, things that are close enough to be finished and that are in a decent enough condition so that we can wrap it up by the time we need to release. And so the Order's short runtime is not born out of an intentional decision to make a tight game focused on what the developers really wanted to do. The Order is short because the developers were up against a clock and needed to take a very ambitious vision and in a short amount of time, cut it and slash the content so that they could meet their release date. They had already delayed the game once, and when somebody else's money is keeping the lights on, in this case, PlayStation, you need to release your game. That is the reality of game development. The fundamental difference in the decision behind why the game is short is what separates the Order 1886 from some of the great short games like Journey or Gears of War or Hellblade 1. Those games wanted to be short and planned from the get-go to build a tight and focused gameplay experience. The Order planned to be a large trilogy with expansive gameplay, and as they approached the finish line, they made the seemingly last-minute decision to chop and cut whatever they could in order to fit together a package before their due date. And that is what leads us to the bad parts of the Order. Because the decision to start big and then right before the finish line cut and slash and piece things together leaves you with some pretty bad and unpolished and out-of-place gameplay elements in the Order 1886. So let's talk about some of those. While I think the cover shooting mechanics are largely good and are more than serviceable for a narrative-driven story like the Order 1886, there are many many moments where I stared frustratingly at my screen. For example, there were many times where while I am aiming down my sights, I have my crosshair pointed at an enemy, but for some reason, the depth of field setting makes everything that I point my crosshairs at blurry, and everything behind it is in focus. So even though I know I have my crosshairs pointed at something, it's not focusing on it. And then I would stop aiming down my sights, and then I would re-aim down my sights, and magically it was fixed, and whatever I pointed my crosshairs at was in focus. And you might say, well, that's not that big of a deal. Well, it kind of is, because it's a shooter, and I need to know what I'm shooting at. And also, it's immersion breaking, because apparently I'm Sir Galahad. I am this 400-year-old elite knight of the order, but for some reason, like 30% of the time that I aim down my sights, it's blurry. It's not a feature, it's a bug, and it's something that they could have fixed if they were focused on this element of gameplay rather than some of the other elements of gameplay that we'll talk about. Another annoying issue that I will kind of chalk up to developers figuring things out at this time, because it happened in a lot of games, is that it's a cover shooter, and there's many times where you want to snap to cover, you push the snap to cover button, and you're running towards something, and for some reason Galahad just darts off in the other direction and takes cover somewhere else where he's directly in the line of fire, and you die as a result. And again, that's annoying, but I also chalk it up to there's a lot of games where that happened, like in Assassin's Creed, where you're Ezio and you tell Ezio to run this way, and he jumps off the building for some reason, but it's still annoying in Assassin's Creed, and it's just as annoying in The Order 1886. And one of the last things I want to talk about with the shooting is how the game completely falls apart whenever you fight Lycans. You know, Lycans, the primary enemy of the game, the enemy that you are shown in the reveal trailer as the primary enemy of the game. Whenever you fight them, the game falls apart. And I don't mean from a glitchy standpoint, it's not that the game crashes, but I mean the actual core gameplay just goes out the window. It doesn't matter anymore because this is a cover shooter game and you're fighting melee combatants, and the game is designed around shooting, and the Lycans don't do that. And so the battles with the Lycans end up being some of the most unintentionally hilarious parts of this game. Let me describe for you how the battles with the Lycans tend to go in this game. You are placed in a warehouse that is big and expansive and tends to have lots of different places, different nooks and crannies where you can find cover and hide and move around. And do you do that when you fight the Lycans? No. This is what happens. You tend to be placed in the corner of a room, and instead of going out and playing hide and seek and trying to find the Lycans and have this really tense exchange, what happens is you're placed in the corner, the Lycans will, one at a time, run at you, swipe at you, and if you dodge it, which is very easy to do because it gives you a button prompt, you can dodge it, and then they'll run away. They don't attack you consistently. They run, swipe, run away, and then you shoot. And then they run at you and swipe and then run away and then you shoot. And that's what happens for every single Lycan battle. It doesn't matter. Like, that's just how it works. And so what could be built up as this horrifying monster encounter where it's something to be feared even by the people in the order is actually really easy because it doesn't even seem like they want to kill you. They just kind of want to swipe at you and run away. And what's frustrating is that the developers had an opportunity to build something truly special and unique here, where when you are fighting against human enemies, you have a really tight, controlled gameplay loop where Galahad feels like he's in control. He's the one with all the power. But then when you introduce the Lycans, it would have been interesting to see Galahad forced into the defensive. Like he really should be scared to come across a Lycan. But no, they're really easy. In fact, even taking damage from the Lycans in any of those battles is a very rare occurrence. The problem, again, is that the core gameplay is designed for the cover shooter around taking cover and shooting, which means there tends to need to be some sort of back and forth with the shooting elements. But all of that falls apart when you introduce a melee combatant like a Lycan. But it's obvious that the developers didn't have time to refine this because there were other gameplay elements they had to focus on. And so obviously the shooter elements are very core to the Order experience. I don't want to get rid of those. I just want to refine them. But there are other gameplay elements that I absolutely think should have just been removed from the game entirely, because I think these are leftover elements of this kind of ambitious vision that Ready at Dawn had, and I don't know why they're here. These are things that I think if you had removed them or just not even considered them at the start of development, the developers would have had more time to focus on tightening up that core gameplay experience, make the shooting feel as good as possible, and then, if you have time, add in some of these other additional elements. For example, in this cover shooter where you play Sir Galahad, the Knight of the Order, you will pick locks. Why? I don't know, because every game in 2015 had you pick locks, I guess. But we don't need to do that. It doesn't serve the story, it doesn't serve Galahad, and it does very little in terms of world building. I think it actually detracts from the world building. Because even though we live in this cool alternate future where we have futuristic technology, we have airships, and we have guns that can shoot lightning, you would think that if we're picking locks, they would use some sort of cool futuristic technology that just totally destroys the locks. It melts them, it makes them useless. But no, whenever you pick a lock, it will take the same amount of time as it would normally if you were playing Skyrim or Fallout or Thief. Again, the thing to add to the world building would be, wow, Nikola Tesla, this guy that is making you this crazy technology, has figured out a way to pick locks in an instant. That's cool, that's world building. But no, Galahad, again, the royal, regal, Victorian Knight of the Order, takes out his lock-picking kit, and while it's futuristic in its technology, he still goes one by one and picks each lock mechanism. It's not necessary for the story. It's really dumb for the gameplay. It detracts from the world building. It should have been cut. In the same vein as the lock picking, there's also this like circuit shorting mini game thing that's basically the same as lock picking, but it's different. So it's cool, I guess. And you maybe do it 5 times in the whole game. This again is another situation where I wish the developers had asked themselves, is this a tool that makes sense in our world for a Knight of the Order to carry around with him? And if the answer to that question is yes, I still want another question to be asked. And that question is this a tool that is essential for our gameplay in the Order 1886? I don't know how you answer yes to both of those questions. The issue with these small little gameplay elements is twofold. One, you are asking the player to learn and master these gameplay elements. So the expectation is that they will come across them fairly frequently throughout the game. But the reality is, you maybe pick 5 or 6 locks in the whole game, and you short out 5 or 6 circuits in the whole game. And you might think, well, yeah, that's about 1 an hour for each of those, so that's pretty good pacing. Well, no. The reality is that you pick 3 or 4 locks in the first hour of the game, and you short out 3 or 4 circuits in the first hour of the game, and then you don't do any of them for like 5 hours. And then in the last few chapters of the game, you pick a few locks and you short out a few circuits, and that's it. So again, they're clearly not essential to the game. They could have easily been scrapped, and no one would ever miss them. No one is playing the Order 1886 because they fell in love with Galahad's lock-picking ability. And then you have gameplay elements that, although they feel fine, they seem completely out of place, at least to me. Like, it's another one of those things that was included because everybody else was doing it. And my example for this is Galahad climbing all over the place. Again, put yourself in the context of this game where you play as Sir Galahad. You're wearing a heavy overcoat. You are this Victorian, regal Knight of the Order. You've got a large machine gun over your shoulder, and your pistol, and your radio communicator, and your knife, and all of these heavy things. And you've got pieces of armor peeking out from under your heavy overcoat. And then you take this character and you tell him that he needs to sidle along the side of a building while hanging onto a gutter like Nathan Drake, because that's what we do in games. It's one of the things that consistently pulled me out of the game, and it happens a lot, is that Galahad is presented as this heavy force of power that can tank through bullets and go fist to fist with lichens in some instances. And then 2 seconds later, he's climbing up buildings and gripping gutters and going across slightly lit edges, because that's how we do platforming and character movement in 2015. And maybe that's just me, and I will gladly chalk this up to my own personal preferences for immersive storytelling and gameplay, but I think you could have Galahad be a primarily ground-dwelling creature, and the game would still work fine. Absolutely, let him vault over cover, let him scale waist-high walls, or even leap up to grab an edge and pull himself up. All of that's fine. But why does Galahad need to be moving around like Ezio and Sam Fisher, shuffling his hands across lightly colored edges? Again, I think the time it would have taken for a developer, or many developers, to make this form of movement work, where you have body rigging and animation and lighting and all the different things that go into this type of movement, I think all of that could have instead been poured into development resources for mastering cover shooter gameplay. But no, Galahad needs to pick locks, he needs to short out circuits, and he needs to traipse around like Nathan Drake, because reasons. And like the weird Assassin's Creed platformer movement, for some of these other bad elements, I want to give lots of grace, as much grace as I can, because these are very much products of their time. For some reason, this is just how games were made. Everyone did these other elements at some time. Well, not everyone, but many games did this at the time because That's what games did at the time. And so while they are annoying, I want to be sensitive to properly judging the order as a product of its time. For example, QuickTime events. Oh man, there's so many QuickTime events in this game. And it's been a really long time since I played a QTE heavy game. I don't miss them. The order is filled with QuickTime events. You're going to be tapping X a lot. You're going to be trying to time out pushing square, triangle, or circle. You're going to be swiping left and right and up and down just to avoid being hit. But for me, the most disappointing aspect of being so QuickTime heavy is that the final boss is basically a QuickTime event. And that is very emblematic of games in the 2010s. And finally, to kind of wrap up the bads of the Order 1886, one thing I need to mention, and I know this is a personal pet peeve, and maybe you identify with this and maybe you have no idea what I'm talking about, but one of my biggest pet peeves is the whiplash of being in a cutscene and sitting for 2 or 3 minutes in a cutscene, and then they give you control, they give you gameplay, and you walk for 4 steps, and then another cutscene happens. It drives me insane. And now, hopefully that I'm telling you, well, maybe not hopefully, because now it's going to ruin it for you, but hopefully, now that I've pointed it out to you, you can know and understand. It's really annoying when I'm watching a cutscene, and then I get control of my character, and I feel like, okay, now I get to go and do, and I take 4 steps, and I'm pulled into another cutscene. There are games today that still do this, and it boggles my mind. There is a 4-second break between cutscenes. You don't need to give me control. You can just make that part of the cutscene. I don't need to walk from one doorway to another. I promise you, it's okay. Just make it a cutscene. And the Order is very guilty of this. You will be watching an unskippable cutscene for a few minutes, and then you'll be placed in Galahad's shoes, and you will walk literally 4 steps, and another cutscene will play. So trust me, if you're a developer, you can just make that a cutscene. You don't need to make me play it. It's okay. Don't do that. And so where does that leave us with the Order 1886? We've got a lot of great, we've got some mixed, and we've got a lot of bad. And so with 10 years of distance between the release and a fresh playthrough under my belt, we need to answer the question, is the Order a misunderstood masterpiece, or is it just a mangled mess? Well, the answer, for me at least, is I kind of understand all the 6s out of 10s. Listen, I want to love the Order 1886. On paper, visually, in terms of its story elements, this checks every box for me. I love the world, I love the characters, the opportunity to dive into the Order and have an alternate history, Victorian London, all of that, awesome. And while that remains true of my experience with the Order, the reality is that even by the developers' own admissions in recent interviews, they tried to do too much in too little time. And it bit them in the end. And that's the hard truth that we have to recognize for the Order, is that if we're being honest, we will probably never get to see what could have been with the Order 1886. We'll never get to see a sequel, not only because the developer Ready at Dawn has closed its doors, but because Sony wants winners. Sony owns the IP for the Order 1886. And if they weren't willing to let the Order get a second chance then, after receiving some middling review scores, and maybe selling 1 million or 2 units depending on some guesstimates, they definitely won't now after the colossal failure of something like Concord. Games are too expensive nowadays, and with AAA budgets sometimes going up into the hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, Sony is not going to look down its list of IP and say, you know what, we should give the Order another chance, when the Order couldn't even deliver the first time it was released. And to me, that's a real shame, because I think the Order is as good, if not better, than many of Sony's exclusive IP upon their first release. I mean, for example, I'm not saying this game is worse than the Order, but let's look back at the first Uncharted game. That game is rough when you examine it, especially from a modern lens. The movement, while smooth in some ways, is really rough and really disjointed in other ways. The shooting is not perfect. There are lots of things that are not great about the first Uncharted game. But look at what Naughty Dog was able to do between Uncharted 1 and Uncharted 2, what many consider to be the best Uncharted in the series. They took a proof of concept for Uncharted 1 and turned it into one of the best and most beloved franchises that PlayStation has. And that's what bums me out, because even though the Order is by no means perfect, we never got a chance to see what it could have been if they had either a little bit more time to polish, to refine, to get it to where it needed to be for its first release, or to see them take that next step in a sequel. And so, much like Galahad, we are left sitting on the rooftops looking at the Order, overlooking a smoldering city that we love in a world that we want to save, but we never get to experience that. But like Galahad, in the midst of painful circumstances, we can choose to pursue goodness and righteousness in our lives. And sometimes that means being really honest and finally admitting to